My name is Margaret Ellison, and the day my own daughter-in-law looked me in the eye and said, "You don't belong in this house," I felt something inside me snap, not loud, not angry, but quiet and final, like a thread pulled too tight at last coming apart. I didn't scream. I didn't argue. I didn't slam a door or throw a single thing into a suitcase. I simply stood there staring into the living room I had painted with my own hands 27 years ago and realized she genuinely believed what she was saying. Maybe worse, maybe my son did too. It's funny how a life can go from steady and familiar to unrecognizable in a matter of minutes. One moment, I was a mother, hoping for a peaceful evening chicken and dumplings simmering on the stove, waiting for them to come home from the grocery store. The next, I was being told no, dismissed from the one place I had poured every ounce of myself into. I'd never felt so small or so unnecessary in my entire life. But before I tell you how everything unraveled and how a quiet walk to the church changed the rest of my life, I should tell you how we got there. I married young, like many women in my generation. My husband Lee worked union jobs most of his life, sometimes 2 at a time, to keep us steady. We bought this house on Birchwood Lane when our son Daniel was just 5. The loan terrified both of us. I still remember sitting across from the bank manager, twisting my wedding ring, promising we'd never miss a payment. And we didn't. Not once. When money ran tight, I cooked beans and stretched leftovers. I clipped coupons. I sewed curtains instead of buying them. And every repair from leaky sinks to peeling porch paint we tackled ourselves. That home wasn't just a structure. It was my fingerprint on every doorknob, every wall, every rosebush along the walkway. When Lee passed 3 winters ago, the house became my anchor and my reminder of him. We had built a life there, quiet, imperfect, but ours. Daniel knew it better than anyone. At least I thought he did. When Daniel married Sienna, I tried to welcome her the same way my own mother-in-law welcomed me, with patience and small gestures. I baked the casseroles she liked. I asked about her family. I never pushed. But there was always a certain coldness in her eyes, a way she looked at the house that made me feel like a guest, instead of someone who had spent decades polishing that banister with lemon oil. Things shifted after Lee died. Grief makes people act strangely, I suppose. Daniel asked if Sienna and he could move into the house while they saved for their own. Of course I said yes. I thought it would be comforting to have voices echoing through the halls again, to have dinner together, to maybe feel less alone. But as the months went by, small things changed. My old dishes disappeared into boxes in the garage. Furniture was rearranged without my input. New rules appeared, like removing my shoes in my own living room. Sienna started referring to the office Lee built as my craft room. And Daniel? Well, he went along with every change without so much as a question. I told myself to let it go. They were young. They needed to build their lives, I reminded myself. Maybe letting go of the little things was the price of family harmony. I swallowed my pride and busied myself with yard work and quiet afternoons at the church lady luncheons. But then came the day everything shifted. It was a Saturday, breezy and cool, the kind of morning where the curtains billow and the air smells like spring, even if the calendar swears it's still February. Daniel and Sienna came home from shopping, arms full of bags. When I tried to take some from her to help, she pulled away sharply, like I was a stranger she didn't trust. Daniel shuffled inside, and Sienna lingered on the porch. I should have sensed something coming. Instead, I smiled and stepped aside to hold the door open. That's when she turned, eyes hard and voice flat, and said those words that still ring in my ears. "You don't belong in this house." Not, "This isn't working." Not, "Let's talk." Not even, "We need space." Just a statement of fact, like she was pointing out the weather. Daniel didn't contradict her. He didn't say my name or put a hand on her arm. He just stared at his shoes. A cold stillness settled over me, the kind that makes you aware of your own heartbeat. First came confusion, then understanding, and finally clarity. If I stayed, I'd be fighting for a place I had already earned 10 times over. And I'd be fighting with people who didn't care about the cost. So I did the only thing I felt I had left the strength for. I quietly took off my apron, set it over the back of the chair, and walked out. No words exchanged, no explanations, no tears. The sun was setting, streaking the sky with oranges and violets, and I found my feet carrying me toward the old church down the road, the one where I'd sung in choirs, served potlucks, and lit candles for Lee after he passed. I didn't go there to pray or fall apart. I went there because sometimes the only way to survive being pushed out is to walk through a different door. And that's exactly what I did. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the very back pew of the church, with the lights turned low, the stained glass dark, without the sun behind it, and the quiet settling over me like a blanket I didn't know I needed. I could still hear Sienna's voice, flat, sharp, certain. You don't belong in this house. For hours it echoed in my head, until the words no longer felt like a sentence, but a doorway. A terrible, painful doorway, but a doorway nonetheless. Morning found me stiff and chilled. I must have drifted off at some point because I woke with my cheek pressed against the polished wood. My body ached. My heart ached worse, and for a few minutes, I simply looked at the empty sanctuary around me, remembering how many times I'd walked through those same doors with Daniel's hand in mine when he was a boy. Back then, I didn't need a pew to feel like I belonged. I belonged simply because I was his mother. Funny how that can change without warning. When Pastor Glenn found me, he didn't question why I was there, or why my eyes looked like I'd been wrung out like an old dish rag. He was a soft-spoken man about 10 years younger than me, with a voice that could soothe a rattled horse. "You want coffee?" he asked, as though seeing a 68-year-old widow sleeping in the sanctuary was the most ordinary thing in the world. I nodded, and he took me into the fellowship hall where the percolator was still warm. We sat at a folding table and drank in silence for a while. I could tell he knew something was wrong, but he didn't push. That more than anything made me want to speak. "My daughter-in-law says I don't belong in my own home," I finally said. He blinked, but stayed quiet. And my son just stood there. He nodded slowly, letting the truth settle between us. Sometimes, he finally said, people say ugly things when they don't realize the weight of them. Or when they do realize it, and they want power. His words stung, not because they were harsh, but because they were true. I realized in that moment that it wasn't just about a sentence on a porch. It was the culmination of a long slide into invisibility. 1,000 small dismissals stacked like driftwood until one spark, Sienna's voice, lit the pile. After the coffee, Pastor Glenn walked me down the stairs to the storage room where the church kept old files and papers. It smelled like dust and hymnals and a hint of cedar from the old nativity props. He handed me a flashlight and said gently, "If you need somewhere to be for a while, you're welcome here." I didn't know why he said it or how he knew I wasn't ready to go home, but I thanked him. Then, like a woman possessed, I started digging through boxes. Maybe it was avoidance. Maybe anger disguised as productivity. Maybe I just needed something to do with my hands besides wring them. But as I flipped through old receipts, newsletters, sign-up sheets, and holiday programs with Daniel's messy first-grade handwriting scrawled across them, a strange calm washed over me. I was remembering myself not just as a widow or a mother-in-law, but as a woman with a life before someone else's opinion tried to shrink me. In one box, tucked inside a weathered envelope, I found a photocopy of the original property survey on Birchwood Lane, our house. Seeing my own signature there made my throat tighten. I remembered that day vividly. Lee and I were young and hopeful, and I had been the one insisting on a garden, a fenced yard, and room enough for Daniel to climb trees. I laugh when I think of it now. There were no trees on that land then. We planted everyone. People forget that a house holds history that walls can't tell. The land remembers. The paint remembers. The soil under the roses remembers the hands that turned it. I felt something shift inside me, a realization I didn't expect. Sienna may have spoken the words, but they weren't her truth to declare. I belonged there more than she ever could, because belonging isn't dictated by legal forms, or who pays the most recent bill, or who talks the loudest. It's built day by day, sacrifice by sacrifice. But that wasn't enough. I needed proof, or at least clarity. Later that morning, one of the church volunteers, Nancy, who used to work for the county clerk, poked her head downstairs. "Pastor says you're looking into something about your house?" she said. I nodded, embarrassed, but too raw to pretend otherwise. She motioned toward a metal filing cabinet shoved in the corner. "You might want to check property tax binders at the county office," she told me. "Sometimes deeds get updated without folks remembering." Updated without folks remembering. The words latched onto me like a hook. Had something changed without my knowing? Had Lee done something before he passed? Or worse, had someone done something after? The thought made my stomach twist. So, instead of returning home or returning to the memory of that sentence, I drove downtown to the courthouse. I must have looked a mess, hair unbrushed, clothes rumpled, but no one questioned me. The woman behind the counter handed me a digital terminal and pointed me toward the screen. "Search name, address, or parcel number," she said. My hands shook as I typed. Birchwood Lane, Ellison. My husband's name, my own. Each result opened up a timeline: payments, liens, long resolved refinancing from 1999 when Daniel needed braces. Then something lodged between my ribs like a swallowed stone. There it was, a filing from before Lee passed, and it showed clear as daylight that a parcel of the property had been put in my name alone. I stared at the screen until the words blurred. Maybe Lee knew what was coming. Maybe he didn't trust Daniel to protect me. Or maybe he just wanted to make sure I had somewhere to go when life turned sideways. Whatever the truth was, I felt my heart beat quicken, not with fear, but with something I hadn't tasted in months. Strength. It was faint, like the glow of the sanctuary candles, but there. And it would only get brighter. I sat in my car outside the courthouse with the engine off and my hands gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles went white. I don't know how long I stayed like that, 5 minutes, 30, maybe more. People walked past cars, pulled in and out. Life went on around me while mine stood still. That document, those few lines of legal language, felt like a rope thrown to someone treading water. Proof I wasn't crazy. Proof my life still had structure, even if my home suddenly didn't. At some point, I noticed the rearview mirror fogging from my breath, and I forced myself to inhale slow, then exhale even slower. The courthouse door thudded shut somewhere in the distance, and I realized I had a choice: march home, waving the deed like a battle flag, or stay quiet and figure out what it actually meant. I chose quiet. Anger burns fast, too fast for a long fight. So instead of turning back toward Birchwood Lane, I drove to the library. It was one of those red brick buildings with creaky floors and a shelf of dusty local history books everyone forgot about. I hadn't stepped foot inside since Daniel was in high school, when he pretended to study while really flirting with girls behind the reference desk. Now, walking through the front door alone, it felt like stepping into another life. The librarian, Miss Carter, older than me with white hair knotted into a bun, looked up over her glasses. "Margaret Ellison," she said in that gentle drawl. "Haven't seen you in a while." It wasn't a question. It was concern wearing a polite disguise. I didn't explain. I just asked if she could help me pull any records tied to property changes or deeds. Her eyebrows rose just enough to show she understood this wasn't idle curiosity, but she nodded and led me to a computer tucked behind the genealogy section. The first thing I learned was that property records are like onions, layer after layer, and if you peel too fast, you end up crying anyway. There were dates I remembered, and dates I didn't. Refinancing after Lee hurt his back on the job. A lien placed when his union went on strike, a fact he'd hidden from me at the time, because he never wanted me to worry. The sale of the adjacent lot he'd always dreamed of turning into a workshop, and the heartbreak of backing out when medical bills swallowed the money. But what stopped me cold weren't the hardships. Those I expected. We lived them. What I didn't expect was finding a name attached to one of the earliest filings, someone I didn't recognize at all. Victor Landon. The name meant nothing to me, and yet there it was tied to an initial contract and then removed from later ones. The librarian leaned in, squinting. Funny thing, she murmured. There was a Landon family lived out past the orchards years ago. Quit the town suddenly. No one ever said why. My mind raced. Had Lee partnered with someone, borrowed money, agreed to something in desperation? Why had no one mentioned this? Why had I never seen the name until now? Maybe most people would have stopped digging right there. I didn't. I printed every sheet I could, the old printer wheezing like it resented the effort. As page after page landed in the output tray, a strange calm settled over me. Each document felt like another piece of a puzzle I hadn't known existed. It made me angry not at Lee, but at the fact that life had kept secrets from me in rooms I thought I knew by heart. By the time I folded the papers into my purse, the sun was beginning to slip lower in the sky. Hunger twisted my stomach, but I ignored it. I drove straight back to the church, my hands steady in a way they hadn't been in days. Inside, the sanctuary was empty, except for dust suspended in the sunset rays. I took a seat halfway up the aisle, not the front, not the back, but a place where I could see the cross clearly and still feel small enough to think. I took out the papers, spreading them across the wooden pew, careful not to wrinkle them like they were something sacred. And in that moment, I realized something important. I wasn't looking for a way back into that house. I was looking for a way back into myself. Somewhere between Lee's death and Daniel's marriage, I had shrunk bit by bit until I was small enough to fit into the cracks of someone else's life. I let people speak over me. I let decisions happen around me. I convinced myself that laying low was the same as being strong. But strength isn't hiding, it's building. And I was going to build again. Just then, footsteps echoed slow, uneven. Nancy, the same county office volunteer from that morning, slipped in holding a folder. "Pastor told me you might come back," she whispered. She handed me the file. "Thought you'd want to see this." Inside were photocopies of transfer records, some signed by Lee, others stamped but unsigned, and one marked void in bold ink. I sat stunned, tracing the letters with my finger. The voided record was from the year Lee was dying, which meant this wasn't an accident. My husband had tried to make sure I was protected, and someone had challenged that attempt, or blocked it, or ignored it. And suddenly, the daughter-in-law's confidence made more sense. People don't speak boldly unless they think they have a guarantee behind them. "What do I do?" I whispered, barely trusting my voice. Nancy sat beside me, her whole frame sinking into the pew. "You figure out what's yours," she said softly, "and then you take it. No vengeance, no drama, just truth." I gathered the papers, stood up, and walked slowly toward the exit. The church doors felt heavier than they had the night before, but this time they opened outward into possibility rather than refuge. I wasn't ready to confront Daniel yet, not until I understood every piece of the story. But I was done hiding, done shrinking, done letting others define where I belonged. And as I stepped into the cool evening air, one thought carried me forward. A woman who uncovers the truth can never again be treated like a shadow. I wasn't going back to the house. Not yet. But the house and the people in it were about to feel my presence all the same. I didn't march into that house the next morning, waving documents and shouting about what I'd found. That would have been too easy and too quick. No, I needed time to breathe, to let the truth settle inside me like wet cement. Truth only protects you once it's fully set. So I woke up early, washed my face in the ladies' room at church, and walked outside into a crisp Indiana morning that smelled of cut grass and cold air. The world looked the same as it had the day before, but I didn't. I could feel it in my bones, an old steadiness rising, something I hadn't felt since Lee was alive. If I was going to understand what my husband had tried to do for me, there was one more place I had to go. The county clerk's permanent archive room, not the service counters. The records basement. That basement had seen more family tears than any church sanctuary. Birth certificates, foreclosure notices, custody battles, land transfers, ordinary people's whole lives shelved in manila folders. A young clerk named Ethan led me down the stairs. "Older files aren't digitized," he said, pushing open a heavy metal door. "So you'll have to dig." He didn't know how close to the truth that was. Rows of cabinets stretched in every direction. I gave him the year I believed the house transfer would have been processed, the year Lee started coughing and never stopped. He pointed me to a drawer and left me there, dust motes dancing around me in the dim fluorescent light. I pulled open the file, and there it was. A deed transfer request listing both Lee and me as owners, filed 3 months before he died. The clerk had stamped it, received, but below that, another stamp read, rejected, incomplete. Someone had scribbled a note in the margin missing signature. But the signature was there, clear as day. Lee Ellison. Underneath was a name that made my pulse stutter. Victor Landon. Not as a co-owner this time, but as interested party prior claim. That name again, like a ghost moving just ahead of me. Suddenly, the puzzle pieces Lee had tried to leave behind started to reorder themselves. This wasn't just about a daughter-in-law hungry for control or a son afraid to stand up. This was deeper, older, rooted in a decision made decades ago that no one had explained. I copied everything I could get my hands on the paper, making hot stripes against my palms as it fed from the copier. And then, because I couldn't help myself, I found the clerk again. "Do you know who this is?" I asked, pointing to Landon's name. Ethan frowned. "Never met him," but he hesitated. "We've got an old property dispute box in storage." He led me back down the hall to a battered gray carton. Inside were courtroom summaries, handwritten notes, even an envelope marked private with no return address. I shouldn't have opened it, but grief and anger make strange allies. Inside was a letter addressed to Lee. "I'm sorry you've had to carry this alone. I know you did what you had to do. Maybe someday the truth will come out." No signature, but the handwriting, it looked almost like Lee's brother's. I sank onto a folding chair. Had my husband taken on a debt, bought land with someone he shouldn't have? Or worse, had someone once threatened to take our home long before Sienna did? I stayed in that chair until my legs tingled. Then I gathered the papers, thanked the clerk with a voice that barely worked, and walked out into the sunshine. The next stop was the only logical one, the church again. By now, the congregation ladies knew something was up. When I walked through the fellowship hall doors, 3 heads turned: Linda, harbinger of casseroles; Penny, who remembered every funeral potluck dish ever served; and Joyce, who knitted prayer shawls for strangers because she couldn't stand idle hands. None of them asked what happened. Instead, Penny pointed her knitting needle toward the coffee pot. "Sit," she said simply. And I did papers spread over the table like a game of solitaire no one else knew the rules to. They read quietly, murmuring to one another. Linda pursed her lips. Joyce whistled low. Finally, Penny set down her knitting and said men protect their families in sideways ways. Sometimes the sideways lasts longer than they do. I swallowed a knot in my throat. Joyce tapped the deed copy. You need someone who understands this language? You're reading it like a mother. Read it like a fighter. A fighter. That word hit deeper than any insult Sienna had thrown. For years I'd survived by smoothing rough edges, soothing tempers, cooking dinners, giving ground so others could take space. I never thought of myself as a fighter. Yet I'd clawed through thrift store budgets, emergencies, illness, and grief. I'd rebuilt from ashes more times than Sienna had painted her nails. Fighter was the right word. Who do I talk to? I asked. They all said the same name at once. Mr. Harper, retired real estate lawyer, widower, comes to church even when he's not sure he believes. He lived on Oak Street just a few blocks away. I folded the documents, tucked them into my purse, and headed out before I could lose the nerve. Mr. Harper's door creaked open slowly. He peered over half-moon glasses. When I introduced myself and explained what I'd found, he nodded once sharply, as if confirming a theory he'd held for years. Bring it in, he said. His dining room table smelled faintly of lemon polish. He laid out the documents, tracing timelines with a practiced finger. After a long silence, he lifted his eyes to mine. Your husband tried to secure that house for you alone, he said. Whatever arrangement he made with Landon fell apart. When it voided, the property defaulted back, but only partially. You hold legal standing. Legal standing. 2 small words, but they meant everything. It meant I wasn't powerless, not disposable, not in the way. Mr. Harper leaned back, folding his hands. You don't need to fight anyone. You just need to show up with confidence and the right paperwork. He didn't know how much courage that would take. Take tonight, he said gently. Let it settle. Tomorrow you go home. Quietly. For the first time since I stepped onto that porch and heard those cruel words, I let myself imagine walking back through my own front door, not as a guest or an intruder, but as the woman who had built the foundation under their feet. When I left his house, dusk had settled. I walked past the church, and for the first time, I didn't need to go inside. My refuge was no longer a pew. It was the truth in my hand. The wind blew through the oak trees, carrying something with it, something I hadn't felt in too long. Resolve. I didn't sleep much that night, but the restlessness felt different this time. Not desperation, not grief, but movement. The way limbs twitch when circulation returns after being numb too long. My heart, stiff and bruised, was waking up. I rose before sunrise, smoothed my hair, and put on the nicest blouse I had left in my overnight church bag. Funny how much courage a clean collar can give a woman. I packed the documents into a neat folder, copies, originals, sticky notes I'd scribbled after talking to Mr. Harper. When I stepped outside, the morning air was cool and smelled faintly of dew and chimney smoke. It brought back memories of Lee leaving for work before dawn, lunchbox and handcoat zipped to his chin. He was a man who believed in showing up early and letting others underestimate you. That always gave him an edge. I decided I'd do the same. By the time I reached Birchwood Lane, birds were chirping along the wires, and the neighborhood kids were still asleep. My house, yes, my house sat there like it always had. The porch railings freshly painted white, the rose bushes dormant for winter, but waiting for spring. Nothing looked different except me. I didn't bang on the door. I didn't call ahead. I simply inserted my key, thank God they hadn't had time to change the locks, and stepped into the foyer. The scent hit me first, lemon floor cleaner and cinnamon from a candle Sienna liked burning. The living room was neater than I usually kept it, the couch throw folded into a perfect rectangle. I noticed the photos on the mantel had been rearranged, my wedding portrait shoved behind a framed selfie of Daniel and Sienna at the Grand Canyon. That stung, but I swallowed the feeling. My footsteps must have carried, because I heard movement upstairs, muffled voices, floorboards creaking. Then Daniel appeared at the top of the stairs, hair sticking up, wearing the same flannel pajama pants he'd worn since college. For a moment, he looked 12 again, caught doing something without thinking it through. "Mom," he said, voice rough with sleep. I stood tall, folder in hand. "Yes, Daniel, it's me." Before he could respond, Sienna emerged behind him, clutching her robe, eyes sharp and defensive. It was almost comical. She was ready for a fight I wasn't bringing. "You can't just," she began. I held up a hand. The gesture surprised us both, but it felt right. "I'm not here to argue," I said evenly. "I'm here to talk. And I have something you both need to see." They exchanged a look, irritation in her, confusion in him, and followed me downstairs. We sat at the kitchen table, the same one I'd served pancakes on for decades. I laid the papers out like a quiet storm. The deed copy, the voided filing, the county clerk's stamps, the letter from Lee. Daniel leaned forward, frowning. Sienna crossed her arms tightly, chin high. "What is all this?" Daniel asked. "This," I said gently, "is proof your father tried to put the house in my name. And while the transfer didn't go through the way he intended, enough of it did, that I still have legal standing." I tapped the corner of the deed. "Which means I'm not a visitor, not a guest, not someone you get to ask to leave." Silence took the room hostage. Daniel stared at the papers, lips parted, shocked into stillness. Sienna looked from me to him, then back, color draining from her face. "What, how, why didn't Dad tell us?" Daniel asked, voice cracking just slightly. "Because he didn't want you worrying," I said softly. "Or fighting. He hoped you'd respect what he built without needing a legal reminder." A hard truth hung in the air. But when Sienna told me I didn't belong, I continued, eyes on my son. I realized I've spent too much time thinking love meant silence. It doesn't. Not anymore. Daniel's shoulders slumped. "Mom, He didn't finish. He didn't have to. Sienna's expression hardened. "So what, you're just claiming the whole house now?" Her tone wasn't angry, it was scared. And in a strange, unexpected way, I felt a flicker of pity. She'd walked into a marriage thinking assets, equity, control. She thought youth gave her the upper hand. But she never accounted for history. "No," I answered calmly. "I'm claiming my place in my own life. And that place no longer fits inside this house. Not with the way things are." Both their heads jerked up. "You're leaving?" Daniel asked. "Yes," I said, "but not the way you think." I gathered the documents and tucked them into my bag. "There's a smaller property that was rightly mine. Your father made sure of it. I'll be moving there." Sienna visibly exhaled relief, flooding her posture, but I wasn't finished. "You'll stay here as long as you take responsibility for it," I added. "Taxes, repairs, maintenance, every leaking pipe and broken furnace, all yours." That got their attention. "Because ownership isn't a crown, it's a burden." I stood, smoothing my blouse. "I'm not leaving because I was told to," I said steadily. "I'm leaving because I chose to. And that's a difference that matters." Daniel swallowed, eyes bright with unshed emotion. "Mom, I'm sorry. I walked to him and pressed my palm to his cheek, something I hadn't done since he was a child. "You fell asleep during your father's lessons," I whispered. "You'll wake up now." Sienna stayed seated, hands clenched in her lap. And I walked out the door, this time with keys, papers, and dignity. No church pew waiting to catch my fall. No tears. Just resolve. I drove straight to the cottage property, smaller, older, but mine. A place where walls still whispered my name rather than erased it. And when I stepped inside, I realized something astonishing. Home isn't where you are allowed to stay. It's where you choose to stand. The cottage smelled like dust, old pine, and memory, just the way places do when they've been waiting a long time for footsteps to return. It sat on a half-acre at the edge of town, tucked behind a row of sycamores so tall they whispered when the wind passed through. I hadn't stepped foot there since Lee and I signed the papers years ago, back when we thought we might turn it into a retirement getaway. Life money and illness had stolen that chance. But now, stepping inside with my overnight bag slung over my shoulder, I felt something powerful settle into me. Not grief, not loss. Something like rebirth. The first thing I did was open every window. Light poured in, dust swirled, and the air shifted from stale to promising. I rolled up my sleeves, found the old broom in the pantry, and began sweeping. Floorboards creaked under my weight like they were waking up too. Within an hour, the loneliness I expected didn't show up. Instead, I felt accompanied by the memory of Lee swinging a hammer, by the echoes of friends who had helped us carry lumber, by the life I had forgotten I'd lived outside of motherhood and marriage. Around mid-morning, my phone buzzed. I ignored it. Then it buzzed again, and again. By the fifth call, curiosity got the better of me. Daniel's name glowed on the screen. I let it ring to voicemail. Because sometimes a son needs to sit with his silence the way a mother has been forced to sit with hers. I cleaned for hours, scrubbing counters, shaking out rugs, wiping down windows until my arms ached in the good way. I found boxes stuffed with forgotten hopes, blank picture frames, unopened sheets, an Afghan I crocheted during live-stream sermons after Lee died. I unpacked and folded and hung things like I was laying bricks of a new life. It was early afternoon when there was a knock at the door. I froze, broom mid-air. Only a handful of people knew where I was. Through the window, I saw a familiar silhouette slender gray suit jacket leaning on a cane. Mr. Harper. He stood with the dignity of a man who didn't arrive uninvited, but always arrived on time. I opened the door. "You didn't think I'd let you start over without checking the details, did you?" he said. There was the faintest tug of humor in his voice. I stepped aside and invited him in. He settled at the tiny kitchen table while I poured him the best cup of coffee I could manage, instant but hot. He unfolded a stack of papers from his briefcase. "You need these," he said, sliding the documents across. "Title clarification form, tax reassignment, change of residency declaration. You'll file them next week. After that, no one can challenge your occupancy or ownership stake." Occupancy and ownership. Words that once sounded like lawyer talk now felt like armor. But he wasn't finished. "You should also consider putting beneficiaries in writing," he added gently. "Your son if you choose, or someone else. But choose. Don't leave the next woman in your shoes." That struck hard, not because it hurt, but because it was true. Pain becomes wisdom if you let it. When he rose to leave, he paused at the door. "You did the right thing," he said. It was the simplest sentence I'd heard in days, and the most healing. Once he left, the cottage felt alive. The air hummed with possibility. I could see my future here, dinners cooked for one, maybe two. Quiet mornings with coffee and crossword puzzles. Evenings on the porch listening to frogs gossip near the creek. The loneliness didn't scare me anymore. Because I hadn't been lonely, I'd been erased. Now I was written back in ink. Just before dusk, my phone buzzed again. Another call from Daniel. This time I answered. "Mom!" His voice cracked, boyish, scared. "Where are you?" "At the cottage," I said. Silence stretched, just breathing on both ends. "I'm so sorry," he finally whispered. The kind of sorry that trembles. I closed my eyes. I know I said, and I did. But apologies are only seeds, they mean nothing until planted and tended. "Can I come see you?" he asked. "Not tonight," I replied softly. "Tonight I need to be here. Tomorrow is possible." I heard the hurt in his exhale, but I didn't bend. Boundaries are doors, not walls, and this one needed to stay shut for one night. We hung up with no more words, and I set the phone aside. That night, the cottage was quiet. Not empty, quiet. I put a quilt over the borrowed mattress and lay down, muscles aching from work, heart heavy, but standing strong under its own weight. As I drifted toward sleep, I smiled. Sienna could claim the big house with the granite counters and the fancy living room rug. Me, I had a roof over my head purchased with effort, love, and marriage, something her newness could never compete with. I had reclaimed a part of my life I didn't know I'd lost. A part I might not have found if she hadn't shoved me toward the door. Sometimes it turns out a woman isn't pushed out of a home, she's pushed into one. Morning light spilled into the cottage the next day, as if it had been waiting for me to open my eyes. For the first time in months, maybe longer, I woke without dread or uncertainty pressing on my chest. I lay still for a while, listening to the birds chattering in the sycamores, and I felt something warm and steady settle in my bones. Peace. Not the kind earned through silence or endurance, but the kind earned by finally stepping into your own life. I made coffee, real coffee this time, grounds and all, and stood by the kitchen sink watching sunlight creep across the yard. There was frost on the grass, glittering like tiny diamonds. I thought about Lee, how proud he might be that I finally understood the message he tried to leave me, even if he never managed to say it out loud. By 8:30, there was a knock on the door. This time I opened it without hesitation. Daniel stood there, hands stuffed in his jacket pockets, shoulders slumped, not in defeat, but humility. Behind him, the wind lifted the edges of his hair the way it used to when he was 6, and running across the yard with a football tucked under his arm. "Hey, Mom," he said. His voice was thin, as if it was fighting through all the things he wished he had said earlier. "Come in," I replied, stepping back. He walked inside, slowly studying every corner of the cottage like it was sacred ground. His eyes landed on the sweeping I had done, the folded blankets, the single lamp I'd set up on the tiny wooden table. The place looked lived in, not because of furniture, but because I was occupying it with my whole presence. "This is nice," he said, voice rough. "It will be," I answered. We sat at the small table, and for a moment neither of us knew how to begin. Then Daniel cleared his throat. "I should have stopped her." He wasn't angry. He wasn't making excuses. He was simply facing his reflection. "She said it, and I just froze," he continued. "I think I wanted peace so badly that I didn't even see who I was sacrificing to get it." My heart squeezed, not in pain this time, but recognition. I knew that feeling. I had lived that feeling. "You're not the first," I said quietly. "And you won't be the last." Sometimes silence feels easier than truth. He rubbed his hands over his face. "I let you down." "I let myself down too," I replied, and his head snapped up in surprise. It took both of us losing something important to see what needed changing. He swallowed hard, eyes shining. "I'm sorry, Mom." This time, the apology felt rooted. Real. "I forgive you," I said, and I meant it not because he earned it, but because I needed it. We sat there for a while, sipping coffee that had gone lukewarm. Then Daniel took a deep breath. "Mom, I want you to come back." "Sienna." I placed my hand over his before he could finish. "No, sweetheart," I said gently but firmly. "I am not going back. Not now. Not the way things are." He stared at our hands. Mine wrinkled his strong and nodded. "I want us to fix this," he whispered. "We will," I promised. "But not in a house where I'm treated like a guest." Daniel let out a tight breath, nodding again. "I'll talk to her," he said. "I hope you do," I replied. "But talk to yourself first. Figure out what you want from your marriage, not what she demands from your mother." He flinched at the truth, but he needed to hear it. Then he smiled, a small, crooked smile I hadn't seen since he was a boy. "You always did know how to land the punch without lifting a fist." We laughed, soft, tired, but healing. After we ate toast together burnt because the ancient toaster needed replacing. Daniel hugged me. It wasn't a polite hug or a quick squeeze. It was long, familiar, desperate, the kind a son gives when he finally realizes his mother isn't permanent or guaranteed. "Can I come back later?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "Just call first." He nodded, stepped outside, and paused on the small front step. "I love you, Mom," he said. "I love you too, Danny." And then he drove away slowly this time, not running from anything, but carrying something he'd forgotten. Later that afternoon, my phone buzzed again. A text from Sienna. "I'm sorry, can we talk?" I stared at the screen for a long moment. The anger I might have felt 2 days ago didn't show up. Neither did triumph. What came instead was the steady understanding that she was young, not in age, maybe, but in wisdom. She hadn't learned yet that power can't be taken, it has to be trusted. I typed slowly, deliberately. Not today, but soon. Because forgiveness is a process, and respect is a boundary. That evening, as the light faded and the sycamores whispered outside, I sat at my tiny table with a notebook in front of me. I wrote down everything I had learned in the past 3 days, not legal notes or warnings, but truths. Sir, a woman's home is not defined by square footage. Peace cannot be negotiated in silence. Love without respect is just obligation. Leaving is sometimes the first step toward staying whole. Truth protects us long after strength fails. I closed the notebook and felt tears prick my eyes, not from pain, but from release. On Sunday morning, I walked into the church not as someone seeking refuge, but as someone returning home. The women greeted me with warm smiles and tight hugs. Pastor Glenn nodded knowingly. "You look different," he said. "I feel different," I answered. Sitting in the pew, sunlight warming my back, I whispered a quiet thank you to Lee, to the house that pushed me out, and to the truth that led me here. I didn't lose a home. I reclaimed my life. And in doing so, I found the kind of belonging no one, not a husband, not a son, not a daughter-in-law, can ever take away. If you're listening to my story right now and you've ever felt like you were pushed aside or told you didn't belong, I hope you hear this part clearly. You are never finished. You are not done growing. And you deserve a place where your presence isn't tolerated, it's valued. Sometimes you don't stay to win. Sometimes you leave to become whole. Thank you for walking this road with me. If this story stirred anything inside, you share it with someone who needs it. And remember, your next chapter may begin on the day someone tries to close a door in your face.